44 years, an entire lifetime stolen by a lie. A black man wrongfully imprisoned finally walks free. But he's not just reclaiming his life. He's coming for justice. And the woman who put him there, she never saw this coming. The year was 1976. The air in Atlanta was thick with summer heat, the kind that made pavement shimmer and turned every breath into a slow, heavy draw. Inside the Greenway Mall, Elijah Carter moved swiftly between the aisles of the department store where he worked. At 19, he was young, sharp-minded, and ambitious, juggling college classes in the morning and long hours stocking shelves in the afternoon. Elijah had dreams, big ones. He was studying business administration at the local college, determined to one day pull his mother out of the small, crumbling apartment they had lived in since his father passed away. His mother, Evelyn Carter, worked herself to the bone as a cleaner at a local hospital, but it was barely enough. So Elijah stepped up, taking this part-time job to ease the burden, to prove to her that they were going to be all right. He was well-liked at the store. His manager, an older man named Henry Whitaker, often praised his work ethic. Customers, at least the kind ones, appreciated his attentiveness. But not everyone saw Elijah as just another worker. Victoria Hale stood near the perfume counter, watching him. She was a privileged young woman of 24, dressed in an elegant white dress that spoke of money and status. Her family was old Atlanta money, generations deep in the kind of wealth that came from owning land and businesses, the kind that kept them far removed from the struggles of the working class, especially black folks like Elijah. She hated the sight of him, a black man working in a place like this, moving with confidence, as if he belonged. The audacity. It made her stomach churn. Her father had raised her with certain beliefs, that some people had their place in society and others should never step above it. And yet here he was, a boy who should have been sweeping streets or shining shoes, standing here in the same establishment she shopped in. Her lips curled into a smirk as an idea slithered into her mind. She would remind him of his place. Victoria stepped forward, deliberately positioning herself in front of Elijah, just as he was stacking cologne bottles onto a glass shelf. "Excuse me," she said, her voice laced with artificial sweetness. Elijah turned, polite as ever. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" She glanced around the store before fixing her gaze back on him. "I need help finding a perfume. Something classic, but not too heavy. Maybe something floral." Elijah nodded and gestured toward the display. "We have a great selection right here. If you're looking for florals, this brand." Victoria cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "No, not those. What do you think suits a woman like me?" Elijah hesitated. Something about her tone sent a prickling sensation up his spine. "Well, if you prefer something elegant, I'd recommend this one," he said, picking up a sleek glass bottle. "It has a subtle jasmine note, not overpowering, but—" She tilted her head, a playful smirk forming. But do you really know about things like this? I mean, you don't look like the type who—" She paused, tapping a manicured finger against her lips. "Well, never mind." Elijah frowned slightly, but kept his voice level. "I can assure you, ma'am, I've been trained on the products here." "Oh," she feigned surprise. "Trained? You mean they actually let you learn about fine things?" Elijah's jaw clenched for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to exhale. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before. This slow, deliberate attempt to chip away at his dignity, to push him into reacting. Victoria pretended to examine a bottle, then turned back to him. "Tell me, do you even know how to read French?" Elijah was done entertaining this nonsense. "Ma'am, if you're looking for a perfume, I'm happy to help. But if you're here to make assumptions about me, I'd appreciate if you took it elsewhere." Her smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Oh, I see. You think you can talk back to me?" Elijah sighed. "I'm not talking back, ma'am. I'm just doing my job." Victoria took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Your job? You really think people like you qualify for jobs like this?" She sneered. "Black morons like you should be cleaning floors, not selling perfumes." A silence fell between them. For a moment, Elijah said nothing. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger tightening his throat, but he pushed it down. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, he exhaled slowly and met her gaze. "You have a pathetic mindset, ma'am. I see what you're doing. You came here to humiliate me, but all you've done is show me what kind of person you are." Victoria's face darkened. This was not the reaction she wanted. She expected him to cower, to stammer apologies. Instead, he stood tall, unshaken. She glanced over her shoulder and noticed something. The security camera didn't cover this particular section of the store. A cruel idea formed in her mind. Before Elijah could react, she grabbed at her own blouse, tearing it apart at the seams. The fabric ripped easily, exposing her shoulder. Her expression twisted into one of terror. She let out a scream. People turned. Heads snapped in their direction. Elijah barely had time to process what was happening before she took off running. "Help!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. "Help me! That man! He tried to. He touched me." The store froze. Every eye turned toward Elijah. Victoria ran straight toward the front desk, tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking. "That man! He grabbed me. He attacked me." Customers gasped. A few women pulled their children closer. Some men, their faces twisted with fury, stepped forward, their fists clenched. Elijah's heart pounded. His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He took a step forward, his hands raised, pleading. "She's lying. I didn't do anything. She, liar." Leah shrieked. "You attacked me, you filthy." Her voice broke into dramatic sobs. The store manager came rushing forward, his face red with confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" Victoria pointed, her hand shaking. He attacked me in the back. He touched me." Henry Whitaker's eyes flicked to Elijah, then back to Leah. "That can't be true. Elijah would never." "Look at me," she screamed, motioning to her torn blouse. "I'm a victim. Are you really going to defend him?" Before Elijah could respond, someone had already called the police. They arrived fast. Too fast. The officers didn't hesitate. They grabbed him, yanking his arms behind his back. "Wait," Elijah protested. "Check the cameras." She did this to herself. But the cops weren't listening. And Victoria? She just stood there, watching with cold satisfaction as they dragged him away. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Elijah's wrists as the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car. The world outside the window blurred as they sped through the streets of Atlanta. His mind raced, his chest tight with panic. He had never been in trouble before, never so much as skipped class, let alone broken the law. And now he was being accused of something unspeakable. Inside the police station, the interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and sweat. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Across from him sat two white detectives, their eyes cold, assessing. "All right, son," one of them drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Why don't you tell us exactly what happened in that store?" Elijah inhaled sharply. He had nothing to hide. "I was working. That woman, Victoria, she came up to me, started asking me strange questions. Then she insulted me, called me racial slurs. When I told her I wasn't going to play along, she ripped her own blouse and started screaming. I swear on my mother's life I never touched her." The second detective, a grizzled man with a thick mustache, exchanged a glance with his partner. "That's an interesting story," he said slowly, flipping through a thin file on the desk. "But you see, we have witnesses. A whole store full of people who saw her running, screaming for help. They didn't see anything. They only saw her after she ran out," Elijah argued, his voice rising. The first detective smirked. "And what about the security footage?" Elijah exhaled, relief washing over him. Yes, check the footage. It'll prove I didn't do anything." But the detectives didn't move. "That's the thing, kid," the mustached one said, tapping his fingers on the table. "That particular section of the store? No cameras." Elijah's stomach dropped. "No cameras. No footage. No proof." "You're lying," he whispered. "There has to be footage." The smirking detective leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk. "You calling us liars, boy?" Elijah swallowed hard. This wasn't just about liar anymore. This was bigger. The system, the cops, the whole damn city. It was all designed to bury him. His pulse thundered as the detectives continued hammering him with leading questions. Every denial he gave, every truth he spoke, was twisted into something ugly. Hours passed and Elijah grew exhausted. His mouth was dry, his wrist sore from the handcuffs. Then came the final blow. The mustached detective slid a piece of paper across the table. "Sign this." Elijah looked down. It was a confession. His head snapped up. "I'm not signing that. I didn't do anything." The detective sighed dramatically. "Listen, kid. You're young. You sign this. We can make sure you get a lighter sentence. Maybe even parole in a few years. But if you fight this, if you drag this out, the courts are going to bury you." Elijah clenched his fists. "Number I won't sign." The detective's eyes darkened. "Suit yourself." The trial was a nightmare. The prosecution painted Elijah as a violent young man, a danger to society. Victoria sat on the witness stand, weeping as she recounted her fabricated story. "He grabbed me," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "He forced himself on me. I was so scared." The jury, 11 white faces, 1 black, listened intently. Elijah's public defender, a man overworked and underpaid, did his best. He pointed out the inconsistencies in Victoria's story, questioned the lack of physical evidence, and emphasized Elijah's clean record. But then came the so-called witnesses. One by one, customers who had heard Victoria screaming took the stand. None had seen the actual event, but that didn't matter. Their words painted a damning picture. Then the final nail in the coffin, a manufactured piece of evidence. One of Victoria's torn buttons found in Elijah's locker, planted. His lawyer objected, demanded an investigation, but it was dismissed. The judge, an old man with years of bias etched into his face, looked down at Elijah like he was already guilty. And then the verdict. Guilty. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Victoria wiped fake tears from her cheeks. Elijah turned to his mother, Evelyn Carter, who sat frozen in the back. Her hands clutched her Bible so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Tears streamed down her face. "Mama." The bailiffs grabbed him, pulling him toward the exit. "Mama, I didn't do it." She stood, shaking. "I know, baby," she whispered. "I know." But knowing the truth didn't change a damn thing. The next 44 years were hell. Prison was a world of its own, a place where the strong preyed on the weak, where men lost themselves to violence, despair, or both. At first, Elijah tried to keep to himself. He refused to let prison break him. But the days turned into months, the months into years. The weight of his mother's pain crushed him. She wrote to him, visited when she could, always reminding him to hold on to faith. Then, after 5 years, the letters stopped. At first he thought the mail was delayed. Then he learned the truth. Evelyn Carter had passed away. His last tether to the outside world was gone. That night, he lay in his cell, staring at the ceiling. The rage inside him burned hotter than ever. He would never forget Victoria Hale. Never forgive. He made a vow to himself. One day he would get out. And when he did, he would make sure Victoria paid. Decades passed. The world outside changed. Cell phones, the internet, new presidents. But inside prison, time stood still. Then a miracle. A lawyer working with a civil rights group took interest in his case. New forensic technology had advanced. Old cases were being reopened. And when they dug deep into his file, they found the cracks. The missing evidence, the forced confession attempts, the racial bias. It took 2 more years of legal battles. But finally the moment came. Elijah Carter, now a gray-haired man of 63, stepped out of prison. The sky was open, the air different. He was free. But freedom wasn't enough. He had lost everything. Victoria Hale had stolen his youth, his dreams, his mother's last years. She had moved on, lived a life of privilege, while he had rotted behind bars. Elijah wasn't interested in starting over. He was interested in revenge. Elijah Carter stood outside the prison gates, breathing in the cold evening air. The world had changed, but one thing remained constant. The fire in his chest. The pain, the injustice, the lost years. It all boiled down to one person. Victoria Hale. For 44 years, she had lived free, unbothered, probably never giving him a second thought. But she had taken everything from him, his youth, his future, his mother, and now it was time for payback. Elijah had nothing when he walked out. No money, no home, no family. But he had something more valuable: patience. He knew revenge wasn't about rushing in and taking her down in a single night. No, real revenge was slow, precise. So he started with the basics. He worked night and day, taking jobs no one else wanted. Construction, janitorial work, unloading trucks. He learned the world again, how technology worked, how businesses operated, and all the while he listened. People talked about power, influence, money. He studied everything: business strategies, legal loopholes, financial systems. Within 2 years, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Elijah had used his time in prison wisely. He had studied business, finance, and the psychology of wealth. And now, he put it all into practice. First, a small investment in a cleaning service. Then real estate. Then stocks. Every move was calculated. Soon, people started noticing the quiet, determined man who had gone from a janitor to a wealthy entrepreneur almost overnight. By the time he was 66, Elijah Carter was one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta. He had the money. He had the connections. Now it was time to destroy the woman who had stolen his life. Victoria Hale was harder to track down than he expected. She had changed her name, moved to a wealthier part of town, and married a real estate tycoon. But no matter how high she climbed, she couldn't hide. Elijah had private investigators gather every detail of her life. She had a privileged existence: country clubs, designer clothes, charity events. But underneath, she was the same cruel racist woman. One investigator caught her berating a black waiter at an upscale restaurant. "You people shouldn't even be allowed in places like this," she had sneered. Elijah watched the footage on his phone, his hands gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles turned white. She hadn't changed. Not one bit. Good. That meant she still wouldn't see it coming. The first step was financial. Elijah started buying out businesses her husband owned. One by one, he dismantled their empire. Stocks crashed, contracts were lost, lawsuits piled up. Within months, her husband's fortune crumbled. Then came the exposure. Elijah had spent months collecting evidence: old police records, bribery transactions, falsified court documents. The moment everything was in place, he made his move. One night, Victoria returned home from a charity event to find reporters swarming her mansion. A breaking news story had just aired. It detailed how she had framed an innocent man, bribed corrupt cops, and destroyed a life for her own twisted pleasure. Every dark secret was now public knowledge. Her past, her lies, her crimes, exposed for the world to see. Within hours, her husband filed for divorce. Her friends abandoned her. And then the police arrived. The same system that had wrongfully convicted Elijah now had undeniable proof against her. She was dragged out of her mansion in handcuffs. Elijah watched it all from his penthouse, sipping a glass of whiskey. One step remained. Prison had aged her. The once proud and arrogant Victoria Hale now sat in a cold jail cell, her hair graying, her face lined with stress. She had lost everything. And then one day she received a visitor. The guards escorted her to the visiting area, and when she saw who was waiting for her breath caught in her throat. Elijah Carter, older, wiser, wealthier, but his eyes burned with the same intensity they had 44 years ago. She swallowed hard. "Elijah." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You remember me?" She let out a shaky breath. I didn't mean for things to go so far." He chuckled. "Number, you meant for me to rot in that cell forever." She shook her head desperately. "I was young. I was stupid." He tilted his head. "You were evil." Victoria's lip trembled. "I've suffered enough. Please, you have to believe me. I regret everything." Elijah studied her for a long moment. Then he smirked. "I don't want your regret, Victoria." He stood up. "I want you to feel what I felt." Her eyes darted around. "What do you mean?" "You took everything from me." He stepped closer. "So I did the same to you." Her hands shook. "You're broke, alone, and you're going to rot in this prison cell for the rest of your miserable life, just like I did." Tears welled in her eyes. "Elijah, please. I'll do anything." He leaned in, his voice a whisper. Be better in your next life. And then he turned, walking out of the prison. As he stepped into the sunlight, he felt something he hadn't felt in 44 years. Peace. Victoria Hale would die in that prison, just like she had planned for him. And Elijah, he was finally free. Elijah didn't just live, he thrived. He dedicated the rest of his life to helping young black men who had been wrongfully imprisoned. He built shelters, funded scholarships, and created opportunities for those society had abandoned. And one day, while walking through the city, he came across a young black boy sitting on the curb, begging for food. Elijah stopped, crouched down, and looked the boy in the eyes. "What's your name, kid?" The boy sniffled. "Jordan Lewis." Elijah nodded. "You hungry, Jordan Lewis?" The boy nodded. Elijah smiled. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." As they walked away together, Elijah realized something. Revenge had freed him. But kindness, that would change the world. Elijah Carter's story was one of pain, injustice, and betrayal. A young man who had his future stolen by a lie, by racism, by a system designed to keep him down. For 44 years he endured suffering that no innocent man should. But he never let it break him. He never let hate consume him. Instead, he turned his pain into power. He didn't just take revenge. He balanced the scales. He ensured that Liar Hale faced the very fate she had sentenced him to. And in doing so, he sent a message to the world. Evil may win for a time. Lies may destroy lives. But truth, patience, and justice will prevail. Yet Elijah didn't let revenge define him. He didn't just take her life away. He rebuilt his own. He became a force for change, an example of resilience. He gave opportunities to young black men who were once in his shoes. He lifted them up so no one else would suffer the way he had. And in the end, his greatest act wasn't taking everything from Victoria Hale. It was giving everything to those who deserved it. Elijah Carter was no longer a victim. He was a survivor, a warrior. And above all, he was finally free.